Hello, Mountain View family. I just want to take a moment and clarify something that I said this past Sunday that I talked about. If you haven't figured out what I'm doing or not by now, typically my opening to the sermons, I like to find some short story or fact or just idea that helps bring kind of a contemporary focus to what is the text talking about, trying to just build people's interest of why is this important to us. Now, a lot of times I don't have time to fully unpack those issues. It's not typically the main focus of the sermon. Sometimes I'll raise an issue and may never settle the question that I raise. Sometimes it's simply just to try to get us engaging into the text in a deeper way. This past Sunday, I actually had the thought of, as I was saying it out loud, I thought, oh, this is actually a bigger issue and I should have taken more time to talk that out and maybe actually say what I think about it. And so I want to do that now. I don't want to distract from next Sunday's sermon because there's a lot going on in that one as well. But in the opening, I talked a lot about some of the post-hurricane responses or post-emergency responses that a number of pretty prominent televangelists, pastors, and even heads of seminary had and said publicly. And someone brought it to my attention, so I thought, well, I already had an inclination to say something about it in clarification anyway. And then when they had a question, I thought, well, I better go ahead and do this. Yeah, it's fascinating to kind of read what people have said publicly about a particular event, the ways that they'll talk about a city. So in general, I really just quoted the words that they had said publicly. In many cases, I actually I tuned the language a little bit down, just because I didn't want the point of where I was heading to be lost by some of their word choices. So in a couple of examples, if you compare what I read to what they actually said, my version is slightly toned down a bit. And again, I'm just not trying to overly kick a hornet's nest, if you will. Maybe turn it over just a little bit gently. Yeah, so in the case of Franklin Graham, though, it's interesting. He actually doesn't, so in most of those cases, they would say some things about the city of New Orleans. One of them was talking about Orlando, I think, as well. And you will see a lot of times where they're making a direct correlation between judgment. And I think Franklin Graham didn't go quite that far. In fact, he was later asked in an interview, was he calling them out or not? And he says, look, I was not calling down God's judgment on them. I was not saying that was judgment. He was saying that it was a chance for revival, which I think I quoted that word in there that he used as well. So the big question that I raised was, is this how God is or not? And then I kind of moved on with the sermon. And so it might actually bear a few minutes of reflecting on, is this how God is? Is God using those events, without trying to put anybody out there or agree or disagree? We just ask ourselves the questions. When we see something bad happening, do we go, yep, God got him? Is that what's going on in the back of our mind? I'll be honest. Having gone to Israel in the last month, you start watching the news for that region a little bit more closely. You see all the missile attacks that have happened. The most startling one was from Iran. And then a couple weeks later, the president of Iran is on a helicopter and the helicopter goes down. What's the first thought and first attitude running through my mind? It's hard to look at everything that's happened and not wonder, was God judging him? And so one thing I think we always need to be careful when we're interpreting modern events is we need to not be presumptuous. We need to be careful not to just assume that our assumption is what God was up to. Whether it is God was judging or whether it's we know that God was not judging. We need to be careful what we think we know and what we think we're assuming about God, because sometimes that can just be presumptuous. We also need to be careful with the language that we use when we're talking about places. There's people trying to do effective ministry in particular cities in very dark areas. I think for those of us living here in Washington, we're very aware of how Christians in other parts of the country talk about this state. We're aware of how Christians in this state talk about this state. Sometimes that's not the most conducive thing to actually being effective in ministry. And so we need to be cautious. We need to be cautious about being overly verbal, but we also need to be careful not to be presumptuous. is Hurricane Harvey judgment on sin? Oh, is any hurricane judgment on sin? Well, if we take the issue and we back out enough, we could say, well, there's a sense in which everything bad that happens ultimately goes back to the fact that the world is broken by sin. And thus, there's a sense in which we can say, yes, all bad things that happen are a byproduct of sin. And in some ways are the side effects of that. Sometimes there are consequences of that, a lingering consequence, and sometimes they're a direct act of judgment from God. And so I would say it's sort of like saying, well, the sky is blue. Yes, everybody who looks up at the sky and sees a blue sky knows the sky is blue. So in that sense, we could look at any event and say, well, this bad event is happening because of sin. I want to read the words of Jesus because I think this is particularly important as we think through what is the relationship between sin and God's judgment in a particular time or place. This is coming out of Luke chapter 13. This is Jesus talking about a particular couple of events. It says, "There were some present at that time who told him about the Galileans whose blood Pilate had mingled with their sacrifices." So Pilate had killed some people and says mingled their blood. Basically, he killed them along with the sacrifices. And he answered them. This is Jesus talking. He says, "Do you think that these Galileans were worse sinners than all the other Galileans because they suffered in this way? No, I tell you, but unless you repent, you will all likewise perish." Now Jesus references a second event. He says, "Or those 18 on whom the tower in Siloam fell and killed them." So some tower fell down, killed 18 people. Jesus again reiterates this question. Do you think that they were worse offenders than all the others who lived in Jerusalem? No, I tell you, but unless you repent, you will all likewise perish. So on the one hand, can we just, in a blanket statement, affirm that all bad events, and we could throw under that natural disasters, we could throw under it health events and all kind of other stuff. Do they all ultimately go back to the fact that God's plan for the world was fractured by sin, and this is the result? Yes, absolutely. On the other hand, we do need to be careful not to create this idea of, there's bad places that God judges, and then there's good places that God doesn't judge. Commentators who were writing about how preachers were calling down God's judgment after, or citing that it was God's judgment after particular natural disasters, noted how silent they were when Houston was hit with Hurricane Harvey. So lots to say about New Orleans and Hurricane Katrina, not much to say about Houston and Hurricane Harvey. But I can tell you, being intimately familiar with both places, they both have the same exact kinds of sins. God is equally distressed by both places and their sin lives. You have to ask, secondary questions of, well, if the flood was judging sinners, what about the righteous who got swept up in the flood with the sinners? There's all of these questions. I think Jesus brings it to a head right here where he says, look, if you think that the people that Pilate murdered, or the people who got hit by the tower, a random act of a random disaster, if you think they were worse sinners than all the people who are alive and standing here today, you're wrong. Unless we repent, we will all likewise perish. And so there's that sense in which we have to be careful not to say, well, there's good and bad places. God does good things for the good places and bad things for the bad places. The disciples ran into this in John, in the book of John, when they found the blind man. And the disciples asked a very basic question to Jesus. Who sinned, this man or his parents? The assumption is sin caused the blindness. And in this instance, Jesus says, neither. He is blind so that you will see the power of God. And he healed him. And it became a huge teaching moment with him and the Pharisees. It's a wonderful story there in the Gospel of John. And so in that instance, Jesus is saying his blindness is not actually a byproduct of sin at all. And so this is where I'll circle back to something I said earlier, which is we have to be careful about presuming. Even with a broad general theological statement of all bad things down here are a result of sin, well, that's true. There's sometimes where a specific of an event, it's distinct and it's unique for something that God is doing that doesn't fit the normal pattern. And so we definitely want to be careful in where we speak and how we're calling things out, whether we're calling something judgment or not. Just being cautious in our words is important, but being careful not to presume. I don't ever want to assume. And you'll hear me in prayer maybe struggle through this if you bring a prayer request to me where it's not clear to me what is God's will in this matter. I might not pray for or against a particular thing you bring for me to pray for. It might be where I'm simply praying that God would make his will known, because I don't want to presume that, well, I think this shouldn't happen, therefore God thinks it shouldn't happen. Maybe God is using a bad event in your life to grow, to grow your faith, to purify you. There might be all kinds of reasons why God is allowing something. And so for me to pray against his purifying work in your life would be counterproductive. We see a place in the Gospels where Peter comes out quite strongly against Jesus, and Jesus looks at him and says, "Get behind me, Satan." And so again, this is where I tend to take a much more cautious approach in how do I find the meaning in a public event. So all of that was running through my head as I started talking publicly about those stories, and sometimes things just sound differently out loud than they did when you were writing them in the quiet space of your office midweek. And then I thought, oh man, I should explain this more. But I think this is like a 10-minute video so far. So they would have added 10 minutes to the sermon on Sunday. So you get the 10 minutes for free right here. So I hope this helps clarify anything that you might have been wondering about.